Hello, this is your host Richard Thornton. Volunteers in northeast Georgia are going out into the woods and fields to relocate ancient archaeological sites that have been forgotten over 125 years. This video is about what we have found so far in the Soquee River Basin. Did you ever wonder how the Soquee River got its name? It's named after a Native American tribe. We're called the Sookie, or Soquee. We'll explain more a little bit later in the program. Sookie, or Soquee, was also the name of the capital town. Sookie, as shown on this 1817 map, is now the community of Batesville, Georgia. The Soquee River begins at a spring at about 4,000 feet above sea level on the southeastern slope of Tray Mountain. It initially flows then southeastward, then southwestward for a total of 28.5 miles at the point where it joins the Chattahoochee River. It's the view of Tray Mountain. The Nacoochee Valley is immediately east of the Nacoochee Valley, through which the Chattahoochee River flows. The Soquee River Basin is characterized by relatively narrow stream floodplains bounded by densely wooded mountainous land. The floodplains tend to be extremely fertile, but the slopes and mountainous land tend to be very rocky, composed entirely of volcanic rock. You see, the Soquee River Basin is an ancient volcanic caldera. Almost all the rock there is volcanic, of varying ages. For much of the stream, it looks more like a small creek, very clear, very pure, and surrounded by pastures, fields, and woods. An ideal habitat for wildlife. It is some of the best trout waters in the southeast. Farther south, when it approaches Clarksville, it goes over a cataract, which is called the Great Falls of the Soquee River, and then becomes a little bit less wild, but still a plentiful supply of trout to be had for fishermen. Who are the Soque? The Soque people, also known as the Soque, Sookie, Soque, Sautee, Soquee, Jokie, and Jocassee, were one of the most culturally advanced indigenous peoples north of Mexico when South Carolina was settled in 1670. They were originally one of the provinces in the Appalachian Confederacy. The Appalachians is what the Creek Indians of northeast Georgia call themselves. The plural of Appalachia is Appalachian. The people in Florida, now called the Appalachee, did not call themselves by that name until they were told that was their name by the Spanish, to confuse the location of northern Florida today with the location of Florida back in the old days when it included Georgia and South Carolina. This map is 1693. Notice that Appalachia occupies Nacoochee Valley. Is that symbol seen too? That's the same as the logo of the Appalachian Foundation. The Appalachee coated the stucco on their temples and public buildings with mica. This caused the structures to glisten like gold. It was their golden-colored temples which started the rumor among the Spanish that there were cities built of gold in southern Appalachians. So they did glisten like gold. The temples contained tame painted buntings, which were maintained and fed by the priests. Each fall, the buntings would fly to Mexico to the home of the sun goddess, bringing with them the prayers of the people who had climbed up to the temple to tell the birds what their prayers were. Soque, Soquee, or Jokie is correctly pronounced. If you're Creek or if you're from Mexico, it's Jokie. That is the same pronunciation as the Soque people in southern Mexico, who are also frequently called the Soque, same spelling. There's a good reason. They're originally the same people, but over the centuries of separation, the Soque began speaking a Creek language that mixed Soque, Itzamaya, and Panoa. What is etymology of the Miccosukee? The Miccosukee is anglicization of the word Miccosukee. Miccosukee is a Mixtec Soque word from Mexico, which means leaders of the civilized people. Sautee. Sautee Creek runs from near the Soquee Valley and the Nacoochee Valley. Sautee is the anglicization of the Itzamaya word for Soquee, Sautee. It's also the Itzatee Creeks and Itzamayas lived next door to the Soquee and Nacoochee Valley. There's my great-great-great-grandfather. Chattahoochee is the anglicization of the Itzamaya and Itzatee Creek words Chattahoochee, which means marked stone or stela, and shallow river. Some of you may remember the controversy of 7 years ago in which the U.S. Forest Service officials of the Chattahoochee National Forest funded a great deal of money, which they pooled with the eastern band of Cherokees to try to prove that the Mayas did not come to Georgia. Well, first of all, most of the creeks in Georgia are called Itzatee, which is Itzamaya word for Itzamaya. But the very name of the forest which they were trying to protect from Williams Creeks and Uchee and Maya Havens is a Maya word. The joke was on them. In 1911, John E. Lazelle became a school teacher to the people known as the Miccosukee. He was the first educated white man to ever live among the Seminoles. Lazelle was interviewed by the Palm Beach Post newspaper on March 1st, 1917. The word Miccosukee was unknown among whites in Florida at that time, and it was not used by the newspaper. The newspaper called these people Mayas. Read my lips, M-A-Y-A-S, Mayas. As you see here, this is a photograph from the mid-20th century of a Miccosukee girl. Look at the profile of this young girl, and on the far right, the side of the famous statue of a woman that was unearthed at Etowah Mounds. They're virtually identical physical features. Lazelle then told the surprising origin of the Miccosukee people. They were descendants of a civilization in southern Mexico that was even older than the Mayas. In 1911, scholars didn't even not know about the Olmec civilization. It would be discovered a few years later. They just said an older civilization. This caused scholars in the United States at the time to questioned Lazelle's credibility, but of course he was telling the truth. He knew about the Olmec civilization. The Miccosukee knew about the Olmec civilization. It's just the gringos didn't know about the Olmec civilization. Lazelle also made another surprising statement. A considerable percentage of the Seminoles in South Florida were descended from Yucatan Mayas who fled to the Lake Okeechobee region after the Spanish invaded Yucatan in the 1520s. Once in Florida, they adapted to the hunting, fishing, and gardening lifestyle of their Maya cousins who had lived in the region for many centuries. The Creeks and Muskogee-speaking Seminoles were described by the Miccosukee as descendants of earlier Maya bands who immigrated to the southeast, then mixed with various less advanced tribes in the region. Early South Carolina colonial archives described the Soque, however, as being very culturally advanced, military powerful, and looking like Mexican Indians. They were describing both the clothing of the Soque and also the fact that they flattened their foreheads. The first map to mention the Soque was published in 1725. It is a map of South Carolina. Often this section of the map is shown on internet sites, Cherokee history sites, as a map of the Cherokee Nation. Well, no, it's not. It's just a corner of the map of South Carolina, and just because a Native American village is on this map does not mean it's Cherokee. They use that as an excuse for naming all the Indian towns in South Carolina as being Cherokee. We do not believe in 1725 that the Soque were inside the Cherokee Alliance. They were on good terms with the Cherokee, that's definite. But they were on the fringe, outside the boundaries of the main tribe, and not officially part of the Cherokee. Between 1660 and 1715, slave raiders from Virginia and later South Carolina coast almost depopulated many areas of southern Appalachians and Piedmont. In 1696, smallpox plague killed a large proportion of the Soque, Appalachee, Coshati, and Ishiti peoples in North Georgia. Many of the survivors fled southwestward. The Soque population was quickly reduced by European plagues, English-sponsored slave raiders from Virginia. Most survivors joined the Creek Confederacy or later the Seminole Alliance. Those Soque who remained were friendly with the Cherokees. From 1785 to 1818, the boundary between the Soque and their Creek cousins ran through Currahee and Yonah Mountain. That's the official boundary. While Tennessee Cherokees had taken complete control of the Cherokee Nation in northwest Georgia. Thus, when Cherokee tribes sold the Soque's homeland in 1818, most Soque moved to eastern Alabama to be among the Creeks. The village of Tlaloco in present-day Lee County, Alabama, is now called Waverly. The scattered remnants of the Soque people were forced to choose sides in the 40-year-long Creek-Cherokee War, which began in December 1715. This is when 32 Creek chiefs were murdered in their sleep in a Yuchi village of Tugaloo during a diplomatic conference, a friendly diplomatic conference, mind you, with the Cherokees, Tugaloo being a neutral town. Now realize that all historical markers, all Chamber of Commerce brochures, and all Cherokee history websites call Tugaloo Cherokee town. In fact, many of them call it Georgia's oldest Cherokee town, founded in 1450. Well, first of all, archaeologists found it dated back to around 1000 BC, and the mounds there dated from 800 AD. But you look at all the maps from the colonial period in Georgia, and it shows northeast Georgia up there being occupied by Yuchi, and it labels Tugaloo as a Hogologi or Yuchi town. And we also have an eyewitness account. The Reverend Charles Wesley, who later co-founded the Methodist Church, at one time was Indian agent for the province of Georgia. He made a trip to Tugaloo. He described Tugaloo as a village of approximately 100 Yuchi, and later commented during the whole time he was in Georgia, he never met a Cherokee Indian. He was curious of what they were like. There was another town shown on colonial maps later on called Soquee, which means place of the Soque. It was located near Clarksville, Georgia, at an older town site that had been reoccupied. This area has a very broad floodplain and had been an excellent location for agriculture. Where did Soque relocate? Well, they went to South Georgia, East Alabama, the Smoky Mountains, Tennessee Valley, Central Florida, Southern Florida, and Oklahoma. On the map, you see the different directions they scattered. The Miccosukee people compose a small, federally recognized tribe in southern Florida. They were once Soquee, who were members of the Creek Confederacy until the early 1800s. Afterward, they joined the Seminole Alliance. In 1962, they were recognized separately by the U.S. government. Tlaploco Tribal Town is a federally recognized Creek tribe in Oklahoma, whose members are descended from the Soquee, who migrated from their homeland in northeast Georgia to present-day east central Alabama and joined the Creek Confederacy. Many Soquee descendants still live in the vicinity of Auburn, Alabama, but are not federally recognized. One band of Soquee was located in present-day Haywood County, North Carolina, outside the eastern boundary of the Cherokee Nation. The United States government labeled them Cherokees. However, many of these Soquee were unable to avoid forced relocation to the Indian Territory. They became the core group which formed the Snowbird Band in Graham County, North Carolina. Soque, or Soquee Gap originally, is named after this Soquee band. Life is indeed like a box of chocolates. My mom always told me. My curiosity about the Soquee began a long time ago. About the time this picture was taken with a girlfriend on St. Simon's Island. My first planning clients after graduation from Georgia State University with a master's in city planning were Waverly, Alabama, and the eastern band of Cherokees. Waverly was originally the Soquee Creek town of Tlaploco. Aha, the plot thickens. As we said, Soque Gap, North Carolina, was originally named Soquee Gap. Most of the anthropological facts taught about the indigenous peoples in Georgia, universities and colleges, date to speculations of early or mid-20th century anthropology professors. Early 20th century author and ethnologist John R. Swanton is their favorite source for the Creek Indians. Swanton didn't know the Soquee existed. John R. Swanton assumed in 1922 that the Creeks had always lived where they were in 1776 when they were visited by the botanist William Bartram. Of course, Swanton wrote the premier book on the Creek Indians, even though it has a lot of inaccuracy in it during the early 20th century. And Bartram's book is an eternal classic. It's actually not written a couple of decades after his travels through the United States, or what was become the United States in the mid-1770s. But by then, there had been radical changes in the locations of where Native Americans lived. John Swanton pretended to know the Creek languages, and there were several Creek languages, mind you, but virtually all of his translations are entirely wrong. Many of his interpretations of Creek cultural history are also wrong. Unfortunately, subsequent generations of academicians and archaeologists in southeastern United States never did any more ethnological research and accepted Swanton's erroneous speculations as scientific facts. This is the principal cause of major errors in history books to this day. Georgia academicians and archaeologists have generally ignored the North Georgia mountains. The only archaeological surveys of the region were carried out in 1886 by the Smithsonian Institute. The report was published in 1891. 1939 by Robert Worship, funded by the WPA. Worship left Georgia permanently before finishing his work or publishing his description. His book was finally published in 1966. By that time, many people had forgotten about his exploration of North Georgia. The 1891 Smithsonian report identified 21 archaeological zones in Habersham County, Georgia. Several were near the Soquee post office. These were carried out by Cyrus Thomas of the Smithsonian Institute. This is a map from his report. Very few people ever read the report. There were no archaeologists in Georgia at that time. In 1939, WP archaeologist Robert Worship couldn't find the Soquee post office or the town of Soquee, and didn't know that the village of Sautee had moved 4.6 miles since 1891. So the majority of stone architecture sites and mounds identified by Cyrus Thomas in 1886 used as a benchmark either the Soquee or the Sautee post office, which made it impossible for later generations of archaeologists to find these sites unless they knew that both post offices had moved. It would take me from 2016 to 2019 to discover the name change from Soquee to Batesville, and that the post office in Soquee was a general store owned by Walter J. Hill. I made this discovery with the help of the staff of the Habersham County Library in Clarksville. Thank you, folks. One of our first projects was the Alex Mountain Archaeological Zone. Notice that all of the mounds, and we counted 12 of them, are precisely related to the Alex Mountain stone circle or stone oval, which is about 400 to 500 feet above these mounds. Here's another view of the Arnold Mound looking up to the Alex Mountain stone circle. You get an idea of the relative distances in height and distance between the mound and the circle. The mound itself very possibly was founded by people from Kolomoki, or the people here founded the mound in Kolomoki. Both mounds have the exact same shape, orientation. The Kolomoki mound today is quite a bit larger. That's because Habersham County Roads Department scraped off the top of the Arnold Mound about 30 years ago to make a road fill. Nearby is the Amy Creek Village site. It does not have any large mounds. It has some small mounds barely visible. As you see, the stone mound there is the most visible. But at the center of the village, where there's a concentration of potsherds, there's a 415 lot line of rocks forming some type of effigy or image. I do not know what it is. You can see it there. It's an enormous stone structure. It looks something like a mace. Perhaps that's what it is. The mace with a stylized flower on top was a symbol of power among the people of the Maya civilization. Most people had forgotten that Batesville was Soquee until the 1920s. But what I also found out was that Soquee was also called Batesville during the mid-1800s, right around the period of the Civil War. Now, the popular myth here is that the post office manager in Soquee in the 1920s changed the name from Soquee to Batesville, but now we know, by looking at the old maps, that it was called Batesville for about 10 or 20 years in the mid-1800s also. We still don't know who Mr. Bates was. Here's a view of the mound from above with satellite imagery. You can barely make it out. This shows you that you cannot always rely on satellite imagery to find archaeological sites. However, when we get down on the ground and begin looking at the shape, I noticed something quite interesting. Notice it's flat, it slopes up, it's flat again, and then there's another mound in the back of this house. Well, this store was built in 1905 on the site of an earlier store built right after the Civil War. So it's quite over an century old. This house was also built during the Reconstruction period of the Civil War, when the first general store was built. Let's take a look at some of the other views of the site. Here you see that there's a house dating from the 1870s on top of what appears to be a mound. Now, what has been going on for the past century is all the tourists going up to Lake Burton drove past this site and just naturally assumed that the topography they saw was created by a bulldozer. But when you start to think about it, there was no paved road into Batesville until the 1920s. It was a very remote location anyway. There's certainly no bulldozers, and there's very few, if any, families in the Batesville area had the money to pay for this much earth removal. Plus, the trees here are anywhere from a century to 2 centuries years old, which put about the right time for when the Soquees abandoned the site and moved southward and westward about 2 centuries ago. So that's the age of the trees lines up pretty quickly. We begin to see something interesting when we look at the terrain map produced by Google. Clearly, there are terraces here. There's something going on here. There's what appeared to be a mound here. When I looked at it closely, it actually was a stone circle. There, or a stone mound. This is another stone circle. This has trademark of man-made activities, and then those small mounds. We decided to go ahead and fund a LiDAR scan of the site. Then these mounds became very clear. This structure popped out. We're not sure what it is, but it appears to be a terrace temple overlooking irrigated fields. This is a irrigation complex here. Beneath it are very visible terraces. The arrangement is very similar to that of the Track Rock site. In creating an architectural rendering of a site with CAD, the first step is to convert it into triangulated matrix. And this is what you see. This takes a long, long time to convert an entire town and its environs to a computer matrix, but it's what is required in order to create a virtual reality image. This is the site plan that was created from that triangulated plan. Notice here more clearly there's a pond, there's two channels that can be joined. There's a channel here that connects with the second stream so they could actually join two streams together to pump water down below here. The main mound appears to have been carved out of an existing mound and perhaps a little dirt at the top. Some of the smaller mounds here are actually more conventional mounds, which they've piled up earthen rocks together. This is another view of the complex. Looking to the north from, say you were in a helicopter over the highway connecting Batesville with Sautee, if you know the area well. This is a view looking north. It's very clear that the temple was built in orientation to Chimney Mountain, which did have smoke coming out of it to the 1880s. That means the mountain is probably a dormant volcano, not an extinct volcano. We know from earlier programs on the Soquee and the Nacoochee that while in Mexico they thought the gods lived on high mountains, especially volcanoes. And so this ties right in that they would come up to a place where there's very similar environs. What they said was that the area where they lived were invaded by people from central Mexico, does not say who, presumably the Aztecs, and so they left southern Mexico and traveled on a trail around the edge of the Gulf of Mexico until they reached the mouth of the Chattahoochee-Apalachicola River. They then followed that river upstream to its head in the high mountains of northeast Georgia. Here's another view from looking from the stone ring that's to the side of the ruins, looking westward. Here's a view looking from southeastward to northwestward to the terrace complex and the structures for irrigation. And this is an example of the Appalachian writing system. It was a stone tablet unearthed by Robert Worship in 1939 at the base of a conical hill, which many people think is a mound, but actually was the home of a survivor of the Roanoke colony out on Adair. This is the marker that was on her grave, by the way. And there's two markers, one in Elizabethan English and one in the Creek writing system. This shows us much more we have to learn. Right now we're trying to piece together the Appalachian and Soque writing system. We're hoping to find information like other stone tablets or petroglyphs that would explain the meaning of these symbols. Until then, though, when we tell you about our latest discovery in this ongoing process with the Soquee Valley, we must bid you adieu and say this is the end.